Doom doom da doom da doom doom da doom da doom doom da doom da doom doom. It's a rare condition this day and age to read any good news on the newspaper page. Love and tradition of the grand design. Some people say it's even harder to find. Well, then there must be some magic clue inside these chiseled walls. 'Cause all I see is a tower of dreams. Real love bursting out of every seam. As days go by, it's the big good love of the family. Welcome to Sup Media Reviews, the podcast that never needs spoiler alerts because it takes you back in time to relive the nostalgia of classic TV shows and films that you've probably already seen. I'm your host, Kiara, and each week I'll dive into the archives to bring you my take on movies and TV shows from at least 20 years ago. From cult classics to forgotten gems, I'll review them all and give my honest opinion on their impact and whether or not they still hold up today. Join me as we revisit the iconic characters, memorable moments, and timeless themes that made these shows and films so special. So take a break from adulting and get ready for a trip down memory lane with Sup Media Reviews. What is up, home slices? Thanks so much for tuning into another episode of Sup Media Reviews. I'm your host, Kiara, and I am stoked to review the 1989 to 1998 television series Family Matters, featuring Jaleel White as Steve Urkel, Reginald VelJohnson as Officer Carl Winslow, Jo Marie Payton as Harriet Winslow, and Darius McCrary as Eddie Winslow, among many others. We'll talk more about them later. I watched the show quite a bit as a child, and Steve Urkel is pretty much a universally known character, so I'm happy to get to relive some of the moments from the show with you. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of this review, here are a few fun facts about Family Matters. Steve Urkel was only supposed to appear once, but the audience's response was so overwhelmingly positive that the producers decided to make him a regular character. He became the most popular character of the show, so much so that they made merchandise based on him, which included a talking doll, trading cards, posters, books, lunchboxes, t-shirts, and a limited edition cereal called Urkel O's. Jaleel White went through puberty as the series progressed, so he had to shave daily and avoid weightlifting. And as he got older, Steve Urkel's clothing became baggier to hide his growing muscles. Jaleel White found it difficult to find work after the show ended, as he was typecast as the Urkel character. Now, I have seen him in a few things here and there since this show ended. He was in Big Fat Liar, which is one of my childhood faves. And he also had a recurring role on Raven's Home, the reboot of That's So Raven. Now, in 2021, Jaleel White reprised his Steve Urkel character after 23 years in a promo with Snoop Dogg to launch his Purple Urkel cannabis line. So Jaleel White is still out here making moves, making money. He's just not in front of the camera as much. And it is unfortunate that our minds are so small that we can't imagine someone stepping outside of a character that they did when they were a freaking child. Like, we should probably grow up and stop doing that. Now, here's the second fun fact. The show lasted 1 year longer than its parent series, Perfect Strangers, from 1986, in which Harriet Winslow was an elevator operator. This was the last American live-action sitcom that premiered in the 80s to end its run. It's also one of the longest-running U.S. sitcoms with a predominantly Black cast. And it is also the first of two shows with an all-Black cast to air on ABC's TGIF lineup. The other was Hanging with Mr. Cooper, which came out in 1992. Now, before I did research for this review, I had no idea that Family Matters was actually a spinoff based on Harriet Winslow's character in a different show, which is amazing because, I mean, Black women are out here making moves and saving the day. And she apparently did so well in the show that they decided to do a spinoff of her family. It's low-key kind of crazy, right? But TGIF, y'all, I feel like that's one of the things that kind of had us in a chokehold back in the 90s. And ABC did their lineup that was full of sitcoms, very centered around family shows. And so there was a number of shows that were on there, including things like Boy Meets World and lots of other shows. So if TGIF was something that you were really into, like, let me know in the comments, like, what was your favorite TGIF show? Now, the final fun fact is that Jo Marie Payton, who played Harriet, said that the show was picked up because the episodes that she appeared in on Perfect Strangers got higher ratings than those that she wasn't in. Here are her own words. The producers came to me and told me they were interested in doing a show similar to The Cosby Show, but with more of a focus on a middle-class family. I liked hearing that because while I think The Cosby Show is a wonderful program, what always rubbed me the wrong way was how perfect everything on that show was. The parents were gorgeous and had these perfect jobs, and their children were perfect, rarely ever getting in trouble. It was not the reality most African American families were experiencing at the time. I wanted to be on a program where the family wasn't perfect. They were flawed, they had problems, they didn't work glamorous jobs, and they made mistakes, but they still loved each other. To me, that was the concept that got me interested in the program. So this is interesting to me because I only partially agree with what Jo Marie Payton had to say about The Cosby Show. I agree that Family Matters was a more accessible middle-class version of like Black family life. So I agree with that part. But when she said that the kids didn't get in trouble and that they were perfect, I was like, nah, like the kids got in trouble quite a bit. And that's actually the most memorable parts of The Cosby Show for me is when they sneak off to do the wretched and they get into car accidents and they get attitudes with their parents about certain stuff. And I feel like the kids got in trouble quite often, but as far as things that would have gotten them in major trouble, maybe not so much. I'm very curious about that. Let me know what you all think about what Jo Marie had to say about The Cosby Show. Now, if you want to check out Family Matters, you can watch all 9 seasons on Hulu and Max as of the recording of this episode. Now, this is where I talk about my personal connection to the show. Now, as I mentioned before, Family Matters was a show that I watched a lot as a child and that I remember enjoying. This was probably the closest thing I saw as a kid to my own experience as a Black child. I feel like the actors in the show look like regular people and a real family. And I don't want you to misconstrue regular to mean basic or ugly. Like these are beautiful Black people. I just mean they look like somebody I would know. Now, the dad was a cop. The mom was like a security officer or an elevator operator in that previous show. I mean, the kids were normal, but they lived in like a nice multi-generational household that included extended family. And so a lot of it felt very real. There, are tons of people who are living in multi-generational households or have family living with them that are not a part of their immediate family. So it was nice to get to see this kind of realistic view similar to what Jo Marie was mentioning earlier. And if y'all don't know by now, I love realism when it comes to shows. And I feel like this show did a great job of keeping the family dynamic something that felt close to home for me. Now, of course, we have Steve Urkel, right? Or Stefan Urkel, which is really some amazing character work by Jaleel White, especially at such a young age. This man basically finagled his way into stardom, even though he ended up kind of pigeonholing himself. And he stole the show, y'all. I found him to be quite annoying when I was younger. And I felt a lot of like Pepe Le Pew energy from him, and we'll get into that later. But it was refreshing to kind of see a Black nerd with some intelligence, albeit not much follow through, right? All in all, he pretty much harassed his family until he became a part of it. And that may be a little problematic. Again, we'll talk about that later. But I really enjoy Steve's connection with Carl. They had a fun dynamic and it was very father-son-like, right? But Steve Urkel, of course, is a highlight of the show, and he is probably like the center of the show in this family. Even though the family has a great dynamic and I enjoy watching them, the show really was like kind of built around Steve. Now, this show actually did some other interesting things, right? And not only examined family life in this household and dealing with like the normal everyday things that families deal with, but it also did this weird kind of fantastical thing that included sci-fi elements, like his transformation chamber where he would turn into Stefan, or when he made the robot Urkel, and more. And I feel like it's an element that I don't remember observing in other Black-centered shows. And while it's done in this really silly way, it is still kind of cool to have these sci-fi themes for Black folks in the early 90s when Black people have pretty much been kind of excluded from the sci-fi genre. So I think that's pretty cool. More importantly, though, they tackle some serious issues on the show: gang violence, police profiling, gambling, and much more. So we love a show that addresses serious issues while still being fun and family friendly, and even kind of pushing the envelope with some of the nerdy sci-fi elements. And I feel like it's just pretty rare that we get to see a Black nerd. So that's pretty cool. Now, I'm super excited to dive into this show, y'all, Family Matters. Now, first, we're going to do a quick overview of the show and the main characters, and then we'll do a deep dive into two of the most iconic episodes. Family Matters is about a Black middle-class family in Chicago, Illinois. The show focuses around the Winslow family, which is Carl, Harriet, their children Eddie, Laura, and Judy, Harriet's younger sister Rachel and her son Richie, and Carl's mother Estelle, who they call Mother Winslow, and their nerdy neighbor Steve Urkel. Now, in this show, we see how this family manages the everyday reality of parenthood, growing up, living in a multi-generational, multi-family household, and having a well-meaning but bumbling neighbor. Let's talk more about these characters. Let's start with Carl Winslow, who is played by Reginald Bell Johnson. He is the patriarch of the Winslow family, and he is a donut-eating police officer with a promising career, as evidenced by his climb to police captain throughout the show. His personality is interesting. He has this capacity to be silly and stern at the same time, and I feel like he is the person who is kind of bothered the most by Steve Urkel's presence. Overall, you can tell he's a man that loves his family and knows how to turn on the fatherly warmth when needed, even for Steve. And for this reason, Carl is often listed as one of the best TV dads in multiple sources. Now, next up, we have Harriet Winslow, who is played by Jo Marie Payton. She is the matriarch of the immediate Winslow family. She is a funny and sassy security officer who is in charge of reeling in Carl when he gets too silly or angry. She's also like a stern mom with a heart of gold and tons of great advice. I think that Jo Marie is a beautiful woman, but I've heard men talk disparagingly about her appearance, and I do not like that, y'all. In this show, she's a middle-aged, dark-skinned Black woman who is fashionable and very pretty to me. I enjoy Harriet. Now, next up, we have Eddie Winslow, who's played by Darius McCrary. He is the eldest son in the Winslow family, and he is basically a work in progress, very much like Theo's character on The Cosby Show. Eddie is an average student, but he's above average in getting into trouble. He's not necessarily a bad kid. He just kind of has this special way of making poor decisions that his family has to get him out of. And all in all, he's a well-meaning big brother who loves women, cars, and his family. Next up, we got Laura Winslow, who is played by Kelly Shanae. Y'all, I can't pronounce her middle name. Kelly Williams. Kelly S. Williams. She is the oldest daughter and second born Winslow child. She is smart, witty, and doesn't always get along with her siblings, which kind of reminds me of myself. This young lady, I've come to realize, has been the victim of unwanted romantic and kind of sexual advances from Steve Urkel, and that is not okay, y'all. She is routinely portrayed as being super mean to Steve, who will not leave her alone and who definitely makes her life harder. Laura is a beautiful, smart young woman who deserved more than being harassed for 9 seasons by Steve and chastised, even in the scripting, for rejecting his incessant advances, y'all. And all this toxicity was reinforced when Laura ends up marrying Steve at the end of the series. This kind of relationship is not okay, and I feel the exact same way about the Parkers with Nikki and Professor Ogilvy. So there is no double standard over here. I do not want us to perpetuate this trope that if you are persistent over a number of years, that you will eventually get what you want. Sometimes you just got to leave well enough alone, people, okay? Next up, we have Judy Winslow, who is, for the most part, played by Jamie Foxworth. She is the youngest Winslow child and is a little bit of a troublemaker. She does the normal, youngest child stuff, like assists with crazy plans and blackmailing her older siblings, but she also has a close connection to her cousin Richie, who is closer to her age. Now, at some point, the actress, Jamie, was booted from the show due to issues with pay, and we low-key pretend that she never exists for the rest of the series, and it's like, WTF. I don't know if predominantly white shows do the same thing. I'm having a hard time thinking of any, but if y'all can think of white shows that have characters that just kind of disappear and we pretend that nothing happens, or that the actress is replaced and we pretend that nothing happens. I don't understand. Like, they had 3 children at the beginning of the series. I believe she was there for maybe the first 4 seasons of the show, and then she's just gone and just not there. And it's like, does this happen all the time? Is this only on Black shows? Because now that I think of it, Jo Marie Payton's character, Harriet, was also replaced in, I think, the final season of the show. So that's something that bothers me. We also have when the actress who played Claire was switched in My Wife and Kids. So it happens a lot in Black shows. And I don't know if I notice it more because I gravitate towards Black shows. Just let me know in the comments. Are there other shows that try to play with our emotions and our minds and try to make us not remember that there used to be a character or the character used to be played by a different actress. Anyways, the actress Jamie Foxworth would go on to have a short adult film career later on. Unfortunate. Or fortunate. Who knows? Estelle Winslow, who we affectionately call Mother Winslow, who's played by Rosetta Lenore, is the mother of Carl Winslow, who comes to live with the family after her husband, Carl's father, passes away. Now, Mother Winslow is a little wild and street smart and is like one of the only characters in the show who seems to like Steve Urkel from the very beginning. Her grandmotherly wisdom and feistiness are a source of groundedness and hilarity in the show. Now, next up, we have Rachel Crawford, who's played by Thelma Hopkins, and Richie Crawford, who's primarily played by Brighton James. And they are two members of the extended family who came to live in the Winslow household after Rachel's husband, Robert, passed away. Rachel is the younger sister of Harriet, and Richie is Rachel's son. Now, Rachel is a bit of a free spirit and is not necessarily seen as being the brightest, but she becomes a pretty successful business owner when she buys the local hangout and calls it Rachel's Place. Now, while she's silly and obsessed with appearing younger, she does have her wise auntie moments, okay? Now, Richie is a really young boy with a curly mullet and has a pretty good friendship with Steve Urkel, especially since he doesn't really have the emotional intelligence to realize that Steve is terrorizing this family. Richie is pretty close to his cousin Judy while she's around, and is really just a cute kid who brings a youthful energy to the show. Now, Steve Urkel / Stefan Urkel, who's played by Jaleel White, is basically the main character of the show and is this nerdy, quirky neighbor of the Winslows. Now, Steve's parents aren't very fond of him, so Steve routinely comes over to the Winslows' house to bother them, show them his latest inventions, and harass Laura, y'all. He usually causes property damage or personal injury with his inventions or shenanigans, and he does this classic, "Did I do that?" line, which is like, take some accountability, Steve, okay? Now, while Steve was the most beloved character on the show, I found him to be annoying even as a child, okay? Steve's transformation chamber, one of his more successful inventions, turns Steve into some alter egos, most notably Stefan Urkel, who is like the more suave, attractive version of himself that catches Laura's eye. Laura even dates this alter ego. And speaking of some sci-fi stuff, I feel like at some point they actually split his personality off to where Stefan Urkel is actually a different being than Steve Urkel, which again, the sci-fi stuff is actually pretty crazy and they go a little far with it. But again, happy to see sci-fi and Black people in the same sentence. Okay. Now, Steve does go on to date another character named Myra, a woman who actually wants him. But the tension with Steve, Stefan, Myra, and Laura all kind of comes to a head and eventually leads to a few breakups and the marriage of Steve and Laura. So Steve gets what he wants. Now, recurring characters include Waldo Geraldo Faldo, who is Eddie's dumb best friend, played by Sean Harrison. We also have Maxine Johnson, who is a close friend to Laura and is played by Cherie Johnson. We have Myra Monkhouse, a girl who has a huge crush on Urkel and eventually goes on to date him, who is played by the late Michelle Thomas. And we also have 3J, who is the adopted son of the Winslows, who is played by a very young Orlando Brown. One of the weird things about some of these shows is that once the younger kids start to grow up and age, the shows feel like they need another very young person to come in. And so like Raven Simone's character was that for the Cosby Show. And so Orlando Brown's character was like that for Family Matters, which is very interesting because of course they go on to both star in That's So Raven later on. Now, lastly, if you're a fan of the show, you know that Jaleel White played a number of other characters, right? Some include his family members like Myrtle Urkel and Cornelius Eugene Urkel. And he also has other alter egos, including Bruce Lee Urkel, Urkelbot, and Elvis Urkel. So got a little bit of that Eddie Murphy energy, like playing multiple characters. Now, overall, this show is really about family and everything that means for a realistic middle-class family of Black folks. We get to see the characters learn, grow, and figure life out together. Now let's get into the review. All right, the first episode we're getting into is season 3, episode 21, called Stop in the Name of Love. I chose this episode because it has a lot of good moments in it, and it culminates in the kinds of shenanigans that we love from this show. So let's get into it. The episode opens with Carl's boss, Lieutenant Murtaugh, coming into his home, like dressed in this weird outfit. I have a really hard time of pinpointing what type of outfit this is. It feels a little like Bagger Vance. It looks British, maybe even a little Sherlock-y. Y'all, I don't even know what to call this outfit. And if he wasn't so silly, it might actually be stylish. Now, Lieutenant Murtaugh is an older white man played by Barry Jenner. He's basically a buffoon with no boundaries. He also has a crush on Rachel. And he's one of the only like kind of recurring white characters on the show. The lieutenant is there to show off his new car, which is a 1969 Pontiac Firebird convertible. Now, right as the two are admiring the car from the porch, a car crashes into it. It is Mother Winslow who comes in saying that Carl should track down the owner of whoever parked their junk in the driveway. So this brand new old school car gets wrecked by Mother Winslow. And then the theme song, As Days Go By, plays. It's literally one of my favorite theme songs ever, and it is sang by Jesse Conaway. Now, the next scene opens up with an outdoor shot of Aunt Rachel's hangout, which is called Rachel's Place. It's a little restaurant that she owns, and a number of different things happen in this location throughout the show. Now, the animated spinning sign outside of Rachel's Place looks awful. Those graphics do not hold up, y'all. But inside the restaurant, Eddie and Waldo are hanging out. Now, Waldo reminds me a lot of Amelia Bedelia. That really is his character. He takes things super literally, and he's not very bright. So let's keep that in mind as we are going throughout this episode. Now, Eddie ends up running out of the restaurant, chasing after a girl who clearly does not want him like that, which apparently is a theme in freaking sitcoms. I mean, come on, y'all. They don't want you, move on. Now, Steve, who works at Rachel's Place, approaches Waldo asking what's wrong with him because Waldo seems to be pretty down. He's upset that he doesn't have the nerve or the confidence to talk to girls, so much so that he's never been on a date before, and he gets sick even trying to ask a girl out. He makes a joke about a 976 number hanging up on him, and I had to look that up, which is very funny. Apparently, back in the day, 976 numbers were the types of numbers that you would call to like get dating advice or hear a horoscope or things along those lines. And so the fact that they would hang up on him is kind of funny, y'all. But I did not remember off the top of my head what a 976 number was. Now, Steve approaches Laura, who also works at Rachel's, and asks her to chat with Waldo about his dating life. He feels like she can give him like some good advice from a woman's perspective and kind of lift his spirits. Steve says that Waldo is so sad that he could depress Richard Simmons, which is actually hilarious. I literally laughed out loud at that because if you all know anything about Richard Simmons, he has this attitude that is like almost toxic positivity if it weren't so funny. Like, it's infectious. Now, at the counter, Lieutenant Murtaugh and Carl are drowning their sorrows in root beer floats because of the damaged car. Now, as they bring Rachel up to speed on what happened, she is shocked that the car is damaged so badly. Lieutenant Murtaugh is like, the taillights are in the glove box, okay? Now, while the lieutenant is talking, I'm looking at him and he reminds me of Benzino. Y'all, this sounds crazy AF, but he literally has a face like Benzino. Go look at this man. I don't know. I literally don't know how to describe it. But anyway, Laura takes pity on Waldo and talks to him about his situation. She tells him that he has qualities that girls will like, but she has a hard time being genuine with her compliments. And she's like, you have the perfect face for your head. Like, that's as good as she could muster up about his kind of looks, right? But then she gets more generous and genuine with some compliments about him being sweet and nice and kind. So, of course, things that are not related to his looks are more related to his character. And so she even grabs his hand and says that he's one of the nicest boys she ever met. And she does it with some real honesty in her voice. So when Laura leaves, Steve pops over and he asks how Waldo is feeling now after having talked with Laura. And Waldo is like, well, I have a problem because Laura is in love with me. And of course, this makes Steve fall off of his chair because Steve loves Laura, right? So later that night, Steve barges into the Winslow household. These sitcoms never lock their doors, okay? Well, Steve barges into the Winslow household saying that Laura has an issue because of the Waldo misunderstanding and lets her know that Waldo actually thinks that Laura is in love with him. Steve says that Laura has to set him straight before Waldo catches feelings for her. And she kind of reassures Steve that Waldo wouldn't fall for her. She's known him for years, right? But right then, right on cue, Waldo comes in wearing a suit with like a bouquet of flowers saying, hello, my love. And so things take a little bit of a turn, right? And he recites a poem for her as he hands her the flowers. And it's funny because he's like, roses are red, violets are blue, Here you go. That was the poem, y'all. The flowers actually turn out to be fake too. And I'm looking at his hairstyle, y'all. His hairstyle has the harshest fade line. It's not even faded. I don't even know how to describe it. Like typically when someone wears more of a high top, there is a gradual fading of the hair on the side of the head. And for him, no, there's no gradual fading. I don't know if there was an issue with the hair folks on the set, like not knowing how to do black hair, or if it was intentional, but I hated it. Okay, y'all. Now, when Waldo asked her to go out with him the next night, she says yes to Steve's shock and surprise. And so when Steve confronts Waldo about asking out, Laura, when he knows that Steve loves Laura, he quotes, "Love means never having to say, I'm sorry, Steve, but I'm taking your chick." So Waldo does not have any qualms about asking Laura out, even though he knows how Steve feels about her. Now, Laura says that she couldn't destroy Waldo's confidence after she told him that girls would be into him. And so she's coming across as this benevolent person, but I would urge that if you are a young lady, never give out pity dates, okay? If you don't like somebody, feel free to turn them down and do it in a way that feels safe to you. But I don't think agreeing to a date that you don't want to go on is necessarily a good idea. So apparently that's why Laura said yes. And Steve is like, well, you don't have any problem turning me down. And she's like, I turn you down because you can bounce back. Okay. You have enough self-confidence to bounce back from this. But Waldo doesn't. And he absolutely does bounce back right off the door jamb that he walks into in the front door. This is the same front door that gets left open for the entirety of this scene, y'all. What is it with people leaving doors open in old sitcoms? That bugs the mess out of me. And speaking of bugs, that's like the main reason why I don't want bugs in my house. Close my door, okay? Now, it's time for the date, right? So the date happens, and of course they are at Rachel's place, and Steve is their waiter. Waldo does not have much cash, so they're doing a cheap date, and Laura is going to be the only one eating. Now, she does ask if it's okay for her to get her food, which is considerate, because I don't know that I haven't been on many dates, y'all. I've been with the same person for almost 10 years now. But being on a date with someone asking like, hey, what's the budget? Like, what are we looking at? I feel like that's so awkward. Being young, it makes sense because they're not making a load of cash, and her asking, like, that makes sense of like, can I get a cheeseburger, or like, can I get a steak? Like, that makes sense. But as an adult, I don't know, y'all. What do you think about that? If someone takes you out on a date and you assume that they're paying, how do you ask, like, are we going lobster or are we going cheeseburger? Like, who knows? Or do you assume that you're at a restaurant that fits the person's budget? Do you assume that y'all are going Dutch and just order what you want or what you can afford? It's very interesting. I don't know why this is coming to my mind, but let me know in the comments, okay? Anyways, Laura asks Waldo to get up and dance, and when Waldo goes to the jukebox, he puts on a slow song, but he dances to it like it's a fast-paced song. He's dancing all over the place. He's drawing attention to them. He's embarrassing her. And granted, he can dance, but he's embarrassing Laura because he's not dancing in an appropriate manner to a slow song. Laura eventually unplugs the jukebox and hides her face in embarrassment back at their table. And she kind of confronts him about dancing poorly. And of course, he gives some stupid answer because, again, he's not very smart. So we also find out that they went to a movie earlier and he booed during the movie that they saw because it wasn't about what he thought it was going to be about. And yeah, he actually does not have as many redeeming qualities as Laura kind of said he did. And then Waldo says, this relationship isn't working out. And she's like, really? And he's like, yeah. And she's like, really? And he's like, you know what, Laura, you should stop begging. Then he breaks up with her and he says, remember that Newsweek heals all wounds. And Laura is like, don't you mean Time heals all wounds? And he was like, yeah, I knew it was one of those magazines. Like, this is the level of silliness, the Amelia Bedelia-ness of Waldo, y'all. Now, Laura says, thanks for letting me down so gently. But of course, she is relieved because she's having an awful time on this freaking date. But she sacrifices her comfort in this moment and on this date so that Waldo has the confidence to go on and ask other people on dates. It's just one of those things where, like, basically, he needed to get his feet wet and know that he could do it so that he could go on and have a more fulfilling dating life and get rid of the nervousness that he had around it. It's very interesting. But again, I don't think young women should sacrifice themselves to build the confidence of a dude, personally. Okay. Waldo says thanks to Laura for being his first date and that he won't forget it. And then when he kisses her hand, her ring gets stuck in his teeth, which is ridiculous. What the heck? Anyways, he leaves the empty restaurant with her ring still in his teeth, saying that he'll return it to her later. So Steve comes over, and by this time the restaurant is empty, which is like a very sudden change. Like there's nobody there. They're closing down. Steve asks her how it went, and he's all too excited to learn that Waldo actually dumped her. He is now happy to be the top person that she rejects again. Now, her hair is actually pretty messed up by this time, but that's how my hair would look at the end of the day too. So it's pretty funny. Again, I can't tell if there is a disconnect with the styling people. It is like the early 90s at this point, and when it comes to hair and makeup, a lot of people in Hollywood have had a hard time with having, the hair and makeup staff be able to do black hair and makeup. I don't know, because her hair on a date, I figured would be like a little more coiffed, but it's one of those things where like if you're younger and you have relaxed hair and you start the day with your hair in a ponytail, like the ponytail loosens up and some hairs start to come out of it. That's kind of what her hair was looking like at this point. And I was like, it probably should have been done better, like just on a professional level and like an appearance level. But as far as realism and being realistic, at the end of the day, that's like what my hair used to look like too. So I'm on the fence. I'm on the fence about it. Now, when Laura and Steve head to the kitchen, Lieutenant Murtaugh and Carl enter the empty restaurant arguing. The lieutenant believes that Mother Winslow is too old to drive, and Carl disagrees. Now, I didn't mention this before, but when they were in Rachel's place earlier, Lieutenant Murtaugh was like kind of roasting Mother Winslow a little bit. He like called her Miss Knievel and was saying like this lady basically like messed up my stuff. Okay. And so in this scene, Lieutenant continues to kind of roast Mother Winslow, right? He's like, I looked her up and her driver's license number was 7. Like she doesn't need to be driving. And so Carl eventually is getting upset, right? And he's like, you need to stop dissing my mama. I believe he said exactly dissing my mama, y'all. And then they threaten each other, right? And so Steve, who comes back from the kitchen, stands between them and he says, hey, you all, let's settle this disagreement over pie. And there's like a glass case nearby that has like 5 pies in it. And so Steve takes one of the pies out of there and he is trying to escort them over to a booth so they can settle their differences over a slice of pie. Now, Lieutenant Murtaugh is like, you know what? Pie is a good idea. And so he picks up one of the pies in the case and he tries to throw it in Carl's face, but Carl ducks and it ends up landing on Steve's face instead because Steve is standing behind Carl. And so when Carl tries to get the lieutenant back, their bodies kind of shift and move and the exact same thing happens. Lieutenant Murtaugh ducks and Steve gets pied in the face for a second time. Now, Steve, of course, is pissed and he's like, you know what? I hate eating alone. And so he takes the pie that's already in his hand and he gets ready to aim it at the 2 men, Carl and Lieutenant Murtaugh, and they're kind of slowly backing away, right? And they're backing away to a door that leads to like the kitchen. And so right when Steve throws the pie, Laura comes out of the kitchen door and it lands on her face. And now Laura is pied in the face as well. And so Laura chases him out of the restaurant saying that she'll punch him out because he references that he needs to punch out like to leave for the day, which is silly. And again, these are like some of the little shenanigans that we enjoy from these older sitcoms. Pie to the face, it's timeless, it's classic, okay? Now, this episode ends with Lieutenant Murtaugh apologizing for all of the yo mama jokes, and they make up a little bit, and Lieutenant Murtaugh decides that he's going to pie himself in the face as penance for being so mean about the mama situation. Carl then says, you know what, I'm going to match that gesture, and instead of pieing himself in the face, he pies the lieutenant in the face as well. The scene freezes and the credits roll. Now, first off, Lieutenant Murtaugh had every right to be upset, and I feel like they didn't do enough to let us know what was going to happen. Like, what's the insurance situation going to be like? Who going to take care of this? It's an old school car. Like, he needs to be reimbursed, okay? But all is well, y'all. All is well. Now, I like this episode because it embodies the spirit of the sitcom, right? We have these silly situations, these misunderstandings, these shenanigans. We have interactions with a bunch of different characters, and we have the resolutions to conflicts, right? And we get to see some of the friendship between Steve and Laura. And even though Steve is still hitting on her, it's not as flagrant or aggressive as in other episodes. And they are behaving more in a friendly manner to help Waldo. So it's an interesting dynamic. And we get to see how helpful and thoughtful Laura is. And even though I feel like she went above and beyond and didn't have to sacrifice her night or her comfort or her own values to help Waldo out, she did anyway. It's a very 90s concept. Like, I'm not doing that today. And we even get some of the issues that people in the sandwich generation deal with when it comes to their aging parents, like taking away your parents' mobility or their license to drive is actually a big deal. And so while they didn't go into a lot of detail, it is an issue that adults deal with. And so it's nice to see a show that takes into account like some of that multi-generationality, right? Of dealing with like, oh, I haven't been on my first date. That's like a kid thing, right? Or you being in the sandwich generation and trying to figure out if it's time for your mom to retire her license. It's nice, right? It's nice to have the different aspects and perspectives roll into one, which is part of the reason why we love this show, y'all. I feel like this episode is kind of quintessential Family Matters at this particular stage in the show, which I believe is season 3. So yeah, you all, let's move on to the next episode. Now, this next episode that we are diving into is more of a serious one. It's season 5, episode 15, entitled Good Cop, Bad Cop. Now, over here at Sup Media Reviews, we usually keep it light, but I really wanted to cover this episode as it's low-key iconic. I remember it from my childhood, and it covers the issue of racial profiling, which still plagues our communities today. So let's get into it. Now, this episode opens with a teenage Laura and Steve watching a Shy music video for the song Baby I'm Yours. Now, if y'all don't know Shy, they are a 4-person R&B group from the early 90s. Their biggest hit was If I Ever Fall in Love. Now, a lot of people know this song, but I feel like in the Black community, this is one of the ones that you like kind of have to know. So you all know the song. It's mostly a cappella and them just going in the background. And if I ever fall in love again, I will be sure that the lady is a friend. And if I ever fall in love so true, I will be sure that the lady's just like you. Oh! Y'all know that song. So this show at different points throughout incorporated different, like, very popular kinds of artists. And so Shy was one of them, and they joined on this episode, which is pretty cool. But it's interesting to see what was popular at the time. And I love that this feels like a time capsule, because at the time we didn't know Shy was kind of like a one-hit wonder. So to see them when they were in their heyday is actually nice. Let's move on, y'all. So anyways, while they're sitting on the couch watching this music video, Steve tries to snuggle up to Laura, but she tells him to back off while she's watching these 4 cuties on TV. And she also tells Steve to drop dead. Okay. Now, Laura then falls asleep on the couch, and in her dream, we see the 4 members of Shy enter her home, and the studio audience is going freaking crazy, right? They sing Baby I'm Yours, which is the same song that's on the music video, but she is shocked when all of the 4 men turn into Steve Urkel, and it's Steve Urkel singing the song to her. So she screams and wakes up from her dream and runs up the stairs. And theme song, y'all. It's one of those things where I feel like over time they're making us feel like he's wearing her down as opposed to her actually really liking him. And again, I don't really care for that perspective. But of course the theme song comes on, y'all. That was the cold open. Now, in the next scene, Carl is enthusiastically watching a football game and doing a touchdown dance on the couch in celebration of the touchdown the Chicago Bears just got. So Reginald Bell Johnson is actually quite agile in this scene, y'all. He can move. Like, y'all, check this out. He's a big guy, but he was moving, all right? Now, right then, Eddie and Waldo come in, excited to learn of the touchdown, and they actually join Carl in standing on the couch doing the touchdown dance celebration. Now, that is the strongest couch in North America, y'all. There was 3 men. One of them was Carl, jumping up and down on that couch, y'all. Standing on furniture was a big no-no in our house and in many Black households, so I'm shocked that they did it on the show. Not very realistic. Now, Waldo says that he is happy to see that Eddie is enjoying himself, especially since he's been so down about his speeding ticket lately. Now, Carl turns off the TV, shocked to learn that Eddie got a speeding ticket for the first time. Now, Waldo, who needs some coaching to realize that he messed up, kind of books it out of there, okay? And so now it's time for father-son talk. Now, apparently this is Eddie's second speeding ticket of the year, and it is February. Eddie was going 86. It don't matter where he was. He could have been on the highway. 86 is too much for literally any place that he was driving. It's freaking crazy, y'all. Okay. Eddie, of course, tries to make a few excuses and trying to minimize how bad it was, but it's reckless. 86 miles per hour is freaking crazy. So Carl, who of course is a police officer, is mad that Eddie was doing such a poor job driving and that he hid the ticket. That's more so what he's mad about, that he did not tell him that he got the ticket. Now, Carl puts his foot down and says that if Eddie gets another ticket, that he is suspending Eddie's license for a year. And when Eddie is like, that's not how the law works in this state. And Carl is like, that's how the law works in this house. And it's like, you know what? Put your foot down, set some boundaries, because driving 86 miles per hour anywhere is freaking crazy. Okay. Eddie goes upstairs. Of course, he's in a huff. And Waldo, pops his head back in and he's like, tell Eddie I'm sorry for revealing his secret, but I won't reveal that he's been skipping class. And now Carl has to go back upstairs to talk some more sense into his son. Now, later, Laura and Steve are in the kitchen doing homework and Steve keeps staring at her. Of course, she's like, please stop. Okay. Richie comes downstairs with a tummy ache and some other ailments that should stop him from going to the dentist the next day. Magically get sick before a doctor's appointment? We've all done it. Now, Steve does an awful job trying to get him to understand that dentists are our friends. He starts going into detail about there being drills and blood and needles and all that stuff. And so Steve is like, you know what, Richie, I'll take you to the dentist and then I'm going to take you to ice cream. And Richie recognizes this as a bribe, but agrees anyway. Now, in the living room, Carl and Harriet are watching TV along with Mama Winslow. And when Carl suggests pie, he tells Harriet to bring him a slice. And then Carl's mom calls him lazy and tells him to get his own pie and to grab her a slice too. And right as he's about to get up, Eddie comes in a huff. He's very upset, y'all. He apparently got pulled over by the cops, and Carl, who's already over it, tells Eddie to hand over his license. Eddie is like, well, are you even going to listen to what happened? So Harriet was like, slowing down the motion, right? The tensions are high. Harriet is like, what happened? What was the ticket for? And so Eddie was like, failure to signal. Now, Mother Winslow butts in and says that she got a ticket once. And she's like, did you know the sidewalk isn't a passing lane? And I laughed really hard because the episode that we just reviewed that came out like 2 years prior to this episode came out, she wasn't supposed to be driving no more. Why is she driving? She's a bad driver, okay? Eddie goes through the story of what happened to him and, the process of him getting this ticket. He was driving to a party in Burlington Heights. The cops they pull him over. And when he asks what's going on, they tell him to shut up. They cuff him and they make him lie face down on the ground and treat him like a criminal. Carl says that the procedure is unusual unless Eddie did something to provoke the treatment. And Eddie is like, no, I didn't do anything. And he says that he was racially profiled while driving in a white neighborhood. Now, Carl expresses a little bit of disbelief, citing that Eddie had lied about the most recent speeding ticket, but he says that he's going to look into it. But then Eddie, of course, is just still upset. Tension's still high from just experiencing this situation with the police. And he says, the only thing worse than what happened to him tonight is that his dad does not believe him. Y'all, in this moment, Eddie is acting his butt off in this scene. I actually got a little bit emotional during this, okay? I was like, oh, go ahead, Darius McCrary, he's acting his butt off now, okay? Of course, Harriet and Carl and Mother Winslow look concerned at how upset Eddie is, right? So we switch over to the next scene, and at the dentist, Richie finishes his dental exam and his teeth look great. The doctor is called Doc Smiley, and he's a black dentist, which is amazing. Black dentist, black dentistry, black doctors, y'all. That's why we need shows like this for representation, okay? Now, in a weird twist, the dentist only agrees to give Steve some cinnamon flavored floss if he can examine his teeth. Steve hasn't been to the dentist in 3 or 4 years, and despite having pretty good dental hygiene, which includes using a water pick, I don't even know water picks existed in the early 90s, but he has a cavity that the dentist finds that apparently needs to be taken care of right away. And it's like, what kind of fantasy land is this? Okay, a dental exam with no appointment, no insurance, no nothing. What land is this? Now, when Steve says that like Novocaine has no impact on him, the dentist suggests nitrous oxide, which is laughing gas. And the silliness, of course, is about to ensue. It's not very important, but Steve takes the gas. He begins laughing and being silly with the dentist. The dentist, of course, is getting annoyed. Steve is picking up equipment and using it. And he's using the rinser, like the rinser that like sprays the water into your mouth to like spray the doctor, and water is getting everywhere. It's a silly scene. Moving on. Because here's what we really are here for, right? So down at a coffee shop, Carl enters the room and introduces himself to two white officers there. Now, the younger officer is Officer Carmichael, and the older one is Officer Jack Evans. Jack is hesitant to shake Carl's hands and tries to leave the coffee shop before Carl insists on having a cup of coffee with them. Now, Officer Evans seems especially perturbed and calls Carl Sergeant with like a little extra stank in his voice. Yeah, he gonna be a problem. Okay, so Carl asks them about a black teen being pulled over on their beat on their shift, and they admit to pulling over someone matching that description, but they end up giving the wrong offense. They claim that he ran a stop sign when the ticket was for failure to signal. So we already know some fishy stuff going on, okay? Now, when Officer Evans asks if Carl is the activist on the force, Carl says, no, I'm a father on the force, and that kid was my son. Now, the younger officer looks kind of guilty over it, and Evans does a little bit too, but in like a different way. And so Evans does this thing where he like tries to divert blame on Eddie, saying that Eddie messed up. But Carl says that he thinks these cops rousted his son. I had to look up rousted because I have not heard that word. But apparently it means to harass. And so Evans switches up his story, saying that Eddie looked like a carjacking suspect. Like, which is it? Did he run a stop sign? Did he fail to signal? Did he do a carjacking and you pulled him over? Which one is it? Officer Evans, which one? Okay. Carl, this is when he gets pissed when the carjacking thing comes up, and he like throws his chair across the room and stands up and starts to get loud, which draws the attention of the patrons at the coffee shop. And Carl ends up calling BS on the carjacking suspect thing because he knows all of the bulletins about carjacking and there's nobody that looks like his son on the list. So Evans is like, well, it's dark and he's black and like I couldn't see. And Carl was like, all right, case closed, lock him up then, right? He's black in a white neighborhood. Let's just get him. Okay. So Evans stands up to leave and basically says that black kids would only be in a white neighborhood looking for trouble, and that Carl should check his son because he gave the officer a lot of lip. And Carl is like, oh, so that's why you cuffed him and made him lay on the ground? Carl's coffee comes, and that kind of breaks up a little bit of the tension, right? Things are getting heightened. And so the younger officer, Officer Carmichael, says that Eddie should have just said that he was the son of a cop and it wouldn't have been a problem. And Carl is like, nah, so y'all only give leniency to the children of cops? No, that's not how this is going to go, okay? He's like, I'm going to file a complaint because I believe you racially profile my son. And Evans is like, well, it'll be our word against your son's. And then Carl says, I don't know how your badge stays on since it's pinned to slime. And that's like a real 1990s read for you. Because one of the best reads that I have heard, and it came from Tabitha Coffee. If y'all don't know who Tabitha Coffee is, I really enjoy her. She's this fantastic Australian hairstylist. She was on a reality show and kind of rose to fame for having like this no nonsense attitude and being like a successful hairstylist. And she ended up having her own show, which is Salon Makeover, or like Tabitha Salon Takeover, where she would go into like failing hair salons and like revamp them and give them a makeover and tell them how to do things better. I love that show, y'all. I wanted to be like to own a hair salon because of that show. Anyways, Tabitha's best read would have applied in this moment. Tabitha Coffee said, would you like a medal or a chest to pin it on? Tabitha Coffee is fantastic, y'all. She's amazing. Anyways, that would have been a fantastic read, but we calling people slime in the 90s, and this is the best they could do. So Evans ends up leaving the coffee shop, and Carl takes a second to talk to Officer Carmichael, the younger one, who's only been doing the job for a year. And when Carl asked him why he wanted to be an officer, Carmichael says that he joined the force so that he could be, a force for good, like good guys versus the bad guys. And Carl is like, that's a good reason, but there's one problem. Your partner is one of the bad guys. And so Carmichael looks pensive as Carl walks away. And so now we have a young police officer who is dealing with being partnered with and under the influence of an officer who clearly has some racist tendencies. And now he has the influence of a sergeant who is telling him that your partner has some problems with people of other races and maybe you shouldn't listen to him. So, Officer Carmichael, he's going to be at a crossroads, and I don't know how effective this is going to be if he has to work with Jack every day. Who knows? Anyways, moving on. Back at home, Eddie, of course, is still upset. Y'all, I've had an unsavory encounter with police officers once, and it upset me too. I was very upset, so I totally understand. For those of you who don't get having a negative interaction with the police and feeling like your life could be at risk and in danger, it is a very traumatizing event, and it requires a lot of healing, some therapy if you can get it. And it actually is very traumatizing. I don't know how else to describe it. So I'm 100% there with Eddie, right? And so Carl comes home for the day and they have a conversation. And so Carl tells his son that he was right about the harassment and that Carl basically confirmed that that cop was racist and they racially profiled him. There was not a real reason for them to pull Eddie over, and that the reason they pulled him over because he was driving while he was Black. And Carl says, it wasn't that I didn't believe you, but I'm a cop and I have to look at things for myself. And so Carl was saying that he had to do things in a way that was more evidence-based than kind of jumping at, chomping at the bit to get these guys. And he was able to confirm that it was indeed racial profiling and it wasn't just how Eddie was feeling about it. And so Eddie kind of understands that it wasn't that his dad didn't believe him. He just really needed to check it out and get the facts for himself. Now, what Eddie does not understand is that the next course of action is that they are just going to file a complaint. And Eddie is like, these men need to be arrested or worse. Like, what are you talking about? File a complaint, doing paperwork. Eddie, again, is traumatized, and it makes total sense that he would want these men to be punished and maybe traumatized the same way he was. Now, Carl tells him that he should give his anger a voice and to try to make a difference. And the way that they should do that is to go through the proper channels and do a complaint. And they hug. Eddie cries and he agrees to go and file the complaint in the morning, and they hug again. There's a few good nuggets here in this scene, right? And so we have father-son moments where both of them are having some vulnerability with each other, which is something that I feel like a lot of fathers and sons do a poor job at, because men in general are kind of chastised for having tender moments or for being vulnerable and open and honest about their feelings, and being closed off is more so rewarded and acceptable. And so having a son who has been traumatized by an event being supported and respected by his father, him being in a place where he's literally crying tears, is really nice to see, because it is very hard to see, like in real life, fathers and sons have that type of closeness and openness with each other. So that part of the representation is very good. I also want to point out that the fact that they decide to go the route of filing the complaint is a little bit interesting to me. And it feels like that they are promoting, like, you have to deal with these situations a certain way to deal with this particular issue. But now that I'm thinking about it, like before social media, before body cams, this episode is suggesting that the best thing that people can do in this situation back in 1994 when it aired was to go through these channels and create a paper trail. Because oftentimes people allow these things to go under the radar, which means that there is a cycle and a history of people doing bad things that isn't documented. And it's like, even if you are not the one incident that gets this person held responsible for their actions, if there's a paper trail of this happening multiple times, there is a more likely chance that the person will be punished or removed from the force or have some other repercussions to go along with for their bad behavior. And so while I feel like a lot of us feel like filing a report is not sufficient, back in 1994, I think that this was the best course of action for something like this today, when the level of accountability for police was lower and they didn't really have the technology to record and have an accurate record of what happens in police interactions. So those are my 2 cents on that. Okay, in the final scene of the episode, Steve comes in with a swollen cheek and a note for Laura to read. He can't talk because of how swollen his cheek is. He says that he's not going to be able to visit her for several days because he needs to be on bed rest due to getting this cavity removed or filled. And she pretends to be saddened by the news and kind of rushes him out of the door to get some rest. And then she dances that he is finally gone and she could be rid of him for a few days. That's the end of the episode, y'all. So I picked this episode because it's one of the ones that kind of depicts some real life stuff that people of color deal with every day. This episode actually aired 2 years after the Rodney King incident, but literally it's like 30 years later and we are still struggling with the issues of like policing people of color and police not having a lot of compassion or openness or patience when it comes to dealing with people of color versus their white counterparts. So I really like that this episode addresses the issue from a unique standpoint as well, because Carl is a police officer and he has seniority over these two officers, which is something that's a little bit more implied because the way they call him sergeant. So he does have seniority over the two of them, and he's using that influence that he has in the police force to make a difference in his own profession, which is a great point because in my opinion, many police officers spend so much time protecting each other rather than holding each other accountable for bad behavior and abuses of power. And there are lots of ways that happens. I actually recently heard of an article that came out about officers abusing power when it comes to children, and it is crazy how a lot of police officers get away with doing these things with basically a slap on the wrist. And so I really wish that people who are police officers would hold each other accountable more because they have a lot of responsibility and you cannot leave that to people who behave poorly or who have biases. So shout out to family members for like raising up this issue in a different kind of way. Now that is all for this episode, y'all. At the end of every review, we ask if the movie or show is worth a rewatch and if it holds up today. Now for me, it's definitely worth a rewatch. I actually enjoyed reliving the show and having some laugh out loud moments that I wasn't expecting. It low-key felt like going home again, y'all. Now granted, the episodes that I chose to review did not have a very big like, did I do that moment? And it didn't really focus on Harriet or Rachel very much, but I still felt like the episodes that I did watch brought up really positive feelings, and I would low-key put this on in the background while I cooked or like folded clothes or did other chores. It's just to have those moments of kind of reliving these episodes that I'm pretty sure I don't remember. Now, as far as it holding up, I'm going to say kinda. The show still has themes that apply to families today, albeit without the level of technology that we have. Like I had an annoying neighbor that wouldn't leave, so I get some of this frustration. Now, it is a depiction of a middle-class, multi-generational, extended family who deals with everyday life events. And it's really good to have a representation of different versions of what family means. It's not always a nuclear family. There are other elements and things that go into building a family, a home base, in a community. Now, I also want to point out that this is a primarily dark-skinned cast, which I think is remarkable considering the amount of colorism that exists in the world and television. The show addresses a lot of family issues, from the silly to the serious and from the normal to like the sci-fi fantastical, okay? It has lots of good things going for it. However, the biggest reason this show doesn't hold up for me is because of the daily harassment that Laura has had to endure at Steve's hands and the way the family did not protect her from him. And essentially, after harassing Laura for a decade, he's rewarded with her hand in marriage, further perpetuating the harmful lie that if a man tries hard enough for long enough, he can wear a woman down. I hate this stereotype and trope in movies and television shows. And again, even with the Nikki Partner and Professor Ogilvy situation where the genders are kind of reversed, it is still unacceptable to me. I think it contributes to the entitlement that particularly young men and young boys have to a woman and her body and her time. It can send messages that when a woman turns them down, that they should persist in trying to pursue them, which can amount to harassment and stalking, and is actually quite terrifying to women. Like, back off. If you get rejected, like, water off a duck's back. There are tons of other women that might be willing to entertain you. So stop overly rotating on these people that don't want you and move on to somebody who does, okay? Now, Steve harasses Laura in almost every episode. The levels to it are a little different. And a lot of times Laura is painted as the villain for turning him down for the millionth time. I don't like that, y'all. This is why it only kind of holds up for me today. It's actually, again, the Pepe Le Pew situation. I don't really mess with it, okay? Now, let's talk about the ratings. Rotten Tomatoes is pretty bad at rating TV shows overall. So we're going to discuss the IMDb rating for Family Matters, which is a 6.6 out of 10. Now, I think that if you asked me in the 90s, I would rate it higher, probably around like an 8.5 or even a 9 maybe. But with everything I know now, I would probably rate Family Matters a 7 for the culture, okay? It's a groundbreaking show that put a dark-skinned Black family at the forefront, so we can't deny its impact, okay? And it's freaking Steve Urkel, y'all. But I really wish that Steve would have left Laura alone. That really is what's docking the points for me right now. Now, thank you so much for listening to my review of Family Matters here at Sup Media Reviews. Listeners, what are your thoughts on this show? Does it hold up for you? Did you rewatch it recently? Share your thoughts with us on our social media pages on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. We want to hear from you. Now, join us next time when I do a special original versus sequel review for Bad Boys and Bad Boys 2 featuring Martin Lawrence and Will Smith. You don't want to miss it. Peace out. Thanks for listening to Sup Media Reviews. I hope you enjoyed our trip down memory lane just as much as I did. If you have any suggestions for movies or TV shows you'd like me to review next, or if you just want to share your thoughts on today's episode, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Pinterest at Sup Media Reviews, and on supmediareviews.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you have a moment, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps me improve the show and spread the word to new listeners. So until next time, peace out, home slices.